So Yahweh promises us certain things in the Bible. That's what we've been going over, God's promises. And in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18, this is one of the promises in the book of Isaiah that we're bouncing off on to do the studies that we're doing right now. In Isaiah 45, verse 18, the promise that God makes to us is there's only one God, and it's Him. It's Yahweh. It's the Creator. It's the one that in the beginning created the heavens and the earth. It's the God who called Abraham out from Ur of the Chaldees. It's the God of Abraham. It's the God of Isaac. It's the God of Jacob. It's the God that called Israel His children. It is Yahweh. In Isaiah 45:18, speaking to the Jews, it says, "For thus says Yahweh the Lord, who created the heavens." He's the God who formed the earth and made it. He established it and did not create it a waste place, but formed it to be inhabited. That Creator God, that Creator says to the world, to the Jews through Isaiah first, and then to everyone by extension. We all have the Bible. He tells us, "I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no other. There's no one beside me." There's never going to be another God who crops up who can challenge Yahweh. Now, I keep calling this God Yahweh. Let me just say this to you. When you see in the Bible the word Lord in all capital letters, like we have it here in Isaiah 45, anytime you see the word Lord or God in all capital letters, that is the Hebrew translator's way of writing the name Yahweh. Remember in Exodus chapter 3, Israel is in Egypt. They're captives in Egypt. They're servants of Egypt. They're slaves. And Yahweh, through the burning bush, calls Moses and says, "It's time for Israel to leave Egypt. I'm sending you to Pharaoh, Moses. You must go to Pharaoh and tell him that God says it's time to let my people go." And Moses makes several excuses to God. He doesn't want to do it. He doesn't want the work. And one of the excuses he makes is, well, how do I even know when I go back, if I do this, when I go back to the Jews and I say, God says it's time for us to leave Egypt, who am I going to tell them that sent me? Under whose authority am I going to my people Israel and saying it's time to leave Egypt? They're going to ask me, who sent you, and what do I say? And in the book of Exodus chapter 3, in Exodus chapter 3 verse 14, God names Himself. God says to humanity through Moses, "I am who I am." You tell them that I am sent you. When God uses the word I am, He says that I am the ever-existent one. He uses the Hebrew word ehyeh, the Hebrew verb to be. I am. I am today. I am tomorrow. I was yesterday. It's the verb to be. I exist, and I always have. And that's what He says, ehyeh. So when the Lord looks down on the earth and talks to man, He says, I am who I am. I am the self-existing, ever-existing one. When man looks back in response to God, He expects us to call Him He who is. He's not ehyeh, He's Yahweh. And that's what the to be verb from me to God means. When I call Him Yahweh, I am calling Him by the name He gave Moses, He who is, the ever self-existing one. That's what this translates. For God to say, thus says Yahweh, the ever-existing one, He who is, He says, I am He who is. I'm the God of the burning bush. I'm the God of Genesis chapter 1. I'm the Creator. I'm the God of Genesis 12 when I called out Abraham. I am Yahweh, and there is no one else besides me. So the promise that God makes to us in Isaiah 45 and elsewhere in the Old Testament is that there is one God. There never has been another God. There never will be another God. And so we're going through the history of Israel and seeing that when God says there is but one God, Satan is immediately ready with a counterfeit. And if God says there is one God and I am He, what is Satan's counterfeit going to be? What's it going to be? There's not one God. His counterfeit is going to be, there are many gods. There are multiple gods. Let me introduce you to them. And Satan has this whole pantheon, this whole panel, if you will, this whole series and system of gods that he's designed and developed for every nation. Every nation that Israel would encounter has their own satanically motivated false gods that do not exist, never have, never will, but he offers them as a counterfeit to Yahweh's truth that he's the only God. God says there's one, Satan says there's many. Yahweh says, I'm the one, I am Yahweh. Satan says, forget about Yahweh. Let me introduce you to Baal and Asherah and Milcom and Molech and Dagon and all of these false gods. And you go through history and it may become Apollo and Zeus and Aphrodite. They just changed names. They're still the goddess of love, the god of war, the god of the seas. His name may be Poseidon. You may change his name to the next nation's names. It doesn't matter. It's this same pantheon of false gods that Satan has propped up to get men's eyes off the fact that there's one God that should be worshipped, and his name is Yahweh. Satan's counterfeit. So we've been watching Israel's history. I don't want to go through that again tonight, but last time we talked about King David and the fact that David was wholly committed to Yahweh. David was a sinner. That incident with Bathsheba and Uriah, her husband, was not good, obviously. But David was committed to worship only Yahweh. And because of that, Yahweh richly blessed Israel. Israel was the richest nation on earth. They had blessings directly from God all the way through at least the midpoint of his son Solomon's reign. Israel was living the good life. And I don't mean a good life materially. I mean a good life spiritually. Israel was walking in an intimate relationship with Yahweh. They were being blessed because they were obeying God. All the way up until Solomon started marrying all the foreign women. And Solomon married 700 foreign wives. He gathered 300 concubines, as we saw last time. And just as God had told him, if you marry these foreign, pagan, non-Yahweh worshiping women, they will destroy you. They will ruin you. You will not bring them to worship me. They will draw you away from worshiping me, and you'll start worshiping all their gods. And that's exactly what happened in the life of Solomon. We saw that last time in 1 Kings chapter 11, how he started worshiping the Sidonian goddess Astarte, how he started worshiping the Ammonite god Milcom. We saw these things. How he started worshiping the Moabite god Chemosh, and he made them temples in high places, and he wanted to please all his beautiful wives, so he kept building, kept spending God's money building temples and high places and altars to false gods to please his wives. It's exactly what God said he would do. Last time we looked at that. One generation from the greatness of King David, who worshiped Yahweh only, to the idolatry of his son Solomon, and all was lost. But I want you to turn to 2 Kings chapter 22 with me tonight, because for a few moments we're going to bathe in Jewish obedience. Jewish obedience. Were there ever good kings? Let me explain this to you so you know the history. In 931 BC, there's an actual year attached to this fact. In 931 BC, Israel was split in two. Because of Solomon's disobedience, Yahweh told him very clearly, I will tear the kingdom from you, but for the sake of your father David, I will leave Judah. I will leave the tribe of Judah in the south and the tribe of Benjamin. But the 10 tribes of the north were taken from Solomon's son Rehoboam. That's what God promised him. So you have the northern tribe called Israel, the 10 tribes of the north. You have these southern 2 tribes that remain. We call them Judah. When you're in the book of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, the king of Judah was this. At the same time, the king of Israel was this. We're talking about 2 split kingdoms. The united nation of Israel that was reigned by Saul, David, and Solomon has split into 2. So now you have a king of the north and a king of the south, a king of Israel and a king of Judah. All of the kings of Israel. I said that to make this statement. Every single one of the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, every single one of them from 931 BC all the way to 722, almost 210 years. Every single one of the Jewish men that reigned as the king of the northern 10 tribes of Israel, everyone is called evil in this book. Every one of them did evil in the sight of the Lord. All of them. Imagine that. God's patience with Israel. For 210 years, every single king was evil in the north, and it took God 210 years to wipe them like someone would wipe a dish clean. So we're in Judah, the southern kingdom. And we have a king whose grandfather was among the worst ever. The Scripture calls his grandfather, as a matter of fact, I think it calls him the worst king the South ever had. His name is Manasseh. You might pronounce it Manasseh. And Manasseh was so evil that Manasseh actually burned his children to the false god Milcom. This is a Jewish king of Judah who is sacrificing his own human children to a false god. That's who we're talking about, Manasseh. And because it says, well, I don't want to read all that. I don't want to get off here. But Manasseh was Josiah's grandfather. After Manasseh died, his son Amon, Amon took the office of king in Judah. And he also did evil in the sight of the Lord. He was a bad king. He followed his father Manasseh, and he was an evil king. He was an idolater. He was not a worshiper of Yahweh. So an evil grandfather, a wicked father, and a wonderfully obedient son. I've asked the question before, how can evil sons come from wonderful fathers? And we see that in the book. How does that happen? The same is actually also true. You know it to be true. How can an evil grandfather and an evil father sire a wonderfully obedient Jew? How can that happen? How does that happen that heritage doesn't transfer? And the simple answer is we all have volition. We all have our own choices to make. And Josiah chose properly. The story of Josiah, look what it says in 2 Kings chapter 22. We're not going to go through all of it. I just want to show you what this particular man did to cleanse Judah, to cleanse the southern kingdom of Judah of this idolatry that his grandfather and his father made so rampant in the land. This was against the family. What Josiah did took courage, like Gideon, chopping down his own father's Asherah pole, crushing his father's altar that he had to Baal, taking his father's steer animal and burning it in fire to Yahweh like Gideon did in the book of Judges. This took courage. For this little boy to say, my grandfather was wrong, my father was wrong, I'm going to straighten these things out with our God, the God of Israel. Look what it says in 2 Kings 22 verse 1. Josiah, Yoshiah, was 8 years old when he became king. He was a little boy when his father died. He reigned 31 years in Jerusalem, and it was a great 31 years for Israel. He did all he could for the southern kingdom of Judah. It was too little, too late, but not for him personally. His mother's name was Yedidah, his daughter Adiyah of Botzkah. He did right. This is the conclusion. This is the conclusion of his life as a king. He did right in the sight of the Lord. He walked in all the way of his father David. Now, David was his ancestor. David was 7 or 8 generations away from him. He's not his biological father. He's on down the road, great grandpa. But he walked in the ways of his ancestor David, nor did he turn aside to the right or to the left. He worshiped Yahweh only. He didn't turn to Milcom, he didn't turn to Dagon, he didn't turn to any other god. This man, this little boy, learned from youth how to worship God, and he never walked away from it. This is greatness in Israel. This is what God wanted every king to be. Another king after God's own heart. As we read, we're going to verse 8 now, but what happens is Josiah wants to restore the temple. The temple is in disrepair. It needs fixing. Josiah says, let's go find out how much money we have. Give it to the masons, to the builders. Give it to the architects. Let's get this temple right. This is in ruins. This is the temple of our God. And look at it. It's in disrepair. The boy wants to fix it. Verse 8. While they're repairing the temple, this occurs. Then Hilkiah the high priest. If he's the high priest, whose family is he from? Who? Levi. And so as a Levite from the tribe of Levi, then who was the first high priest? Who is this man's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather? Aaron. Moses' brother Aaron, the first high priest of Israel. This is an Aaronic man. He's from the tribe of Levi, the family of Aaron. His name is Hilkiah. Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, they're working in the temple. And this is what he says, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. That's the temple. I have found the book of the Lord, or the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, who read it. Now, what does it mean if you find something? Right before you find something, what is its condition? Lost. Look at what was lost in Israel. For all of the reign of Grandpa Manasseh, for all of the reign of Ammon, a very short reign, I think it was a couple of years, but Manasseh reigned for many, many, many decades. Look what was lost, the book of the law of Moses. The law of Israel, the Mosaic law, was lost to the Jews. And the high priest finds it oh, look what I found. Look what I found underneath the computer. I might say, I found that paper I was looking for under the computer. Here it is right here. It was lost and nobody even knew it was lost. This is Israel's worship document, and they don't even know that they're not in possession of it. That's how far gone Israel was. Judah, the southern kingdom, down the road to idolatry. Look at what it says in verse 9. Shaphan the scribe came to the king. Who's the king? Josiah, Yoshia. He brought back word to the king and he said, your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house. They've delivered it into the hand of the workmen who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. So the money is in the contractor's hands. They're restoring the temple. But guess what else? He says, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. Like I didn't even know this book existed. But listen to what this book says. Hilkiah the priest has given me a book, and Shaphan the scribe, a scribe would have been a learned man, right? A scribe, a writer, a reader and a writer, a learned man. The scribe Shaphan read it in the presence of the king. And what was Josiah's response to reading the Holy Scripture and the law of Moses? It says he tore his clothes. He immediately went into mourning for his nation. When he realized what the law said, what the God of Israel expected from Israel, when he realized how Israel should have been living before they got their God, and realized what Grandpa had done and what Father stood for, he realized immediately we are in opposition to our God. We have rejected our God. He has to be upset with Israel. We're in real trouble. And he began mourning for his nation. That's this tearing of the clothes. We stand guilty before the living God according to what he wrote us in this book that somehow the priesthood has lost. The king commanded Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam the son of Shaphan, Achbor the son of Micaiah, Shaphan the scribe, and Isaiah the king's servant. He's got a group of men that he is going to give command to. In verse 13, he says, you go, inquire of Yahweh for me. I need to know from the author of this book, God Himself, what condition we are in Israel before Him. So you go and you inquire of Yahweh for me and all the people and all Judah concerning the words of this book. Are we still supposed to be living by this book? He wants to know what God's opinion is. He says, according to this book, concerning the words of this book that has been found, for great is the wrath of the Lord that burns against Israel. If this book is right, and it has to be, then we have rejected the words, the commands, the mandates of God, and we are in serious trouble. Great is the wrath of the Lord that burns against us, because our fathers, my own included, he would say, Manasseh, my grandfather, and Ammon, my father, our fathers have not listened to the words of this book to do, not to know it, but to act it out, to live it out, to live according to it, to do according to all that is written concerning us. So Josiah realizes we are in serious trouble and we have to do something about this. 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 1. The king sent, and they gathered to him all the elders of Judah and of Jerusalem. So he gathers the wise men. The king went up to the house of the Lord, so he goes to the temple himself, and all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem were with him, and the priests and the prophets and all the people, both small and great. He's gathered everyone in Judah. The great, the small, the men, the women, the children. He's gathered them all together, both small and great. And what does he do when he gathers them? He reads to them the law of Moses, the Word of God. He teaches them the Scripture. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, the law, the Mosaic law, which was found in the house of the Lord. Now let me just say a couple of things before we go on about the covenant. Covenant is the Hebrew word berit, B-E-R-I-T, berit. And it's a contract. A covenant is a contract. It's an agreement between two parties. You do your part, I do my part, and this is what we agree to. If you do your part, then this. If I do my part, then this. It is a covenant. It's a contract. And in the book, in the law, it's contractual. Israel, if you do certain things, then I, God, will respond in a certain way. Israel, if you do not do certain things, then I, God, will respond in a certain way. Choose cursing or choose blessing. Choose life or choose death. It's your choice. The law dictates it. You choose and let me know. It's the Jew's choice. This is what it says in the law concerning the covenant idea. You do your part, and I'll bless. You disobey your part, and I'll curse. Very simple. In Exodus chapter 19, the chapter before we go to Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments are given in chapter 20, but in Exodus 19, the Scripture says, now then, if, here's a huge if in the Bible, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then if you obey, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples. There won't be another people on earth like the Jews, my chosen possession, my nation, for all the earth is mine. I can choose. I'm the Creator, and I want Israel to be my chosen possession. If you obey my voice and keep my commandment, you will be my own chosen nation, my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. If you do right, I will bless you in this way. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel, he tells Moses. So this is God's deal with Moses. You will be the preeminent nation, Israel, on earth. If you obey me, you won't have enemies, or you won't have enemies that can defeat you. Everybody will fall. You won't be sick. You go to Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 15 and following, and you see all the wonderful things, or the first 14 verses, I should say, Deuteronomy 28 verse 1 to 14, and you'll see all the things he blessed him. Your crops will be fervent, the rain, I'll give you the rains from heaven, your crops, your cattle, your flocks, your goats, your sheep, everything, your camels, everything you touch. I mean, you talk about the Midas touch and everything turning to gold. you will have it made. The curses of Egypt, the plagues of Egypt will not befall you. The illnesses of Egypt will not fall upon you. You'll be blessed. All your women will be fertile. You'll have large families. Everybody will be happy and blessed. But if you don't obey me, there's another side to the promise. But this is the covenant. If you will obey, you'll be my own people. I'll make you a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. I'll set you apart. You'll be distinct of all the nations of the world. That's what he promises them. But in 2 Kings chapter 23, let's go back to it. That's what he says here, the covenant, the words of the book of the covenant. This was the agreement. If you'll obey, I'll bless you exponentially. You've never had a better life than what I'll give you on earth, O Israel. The king stood by the pillar. He's already read the law to the people. The king stood by the pillar and he made a covenant before the Lord. And this is the covenant that this young man, this is the contract that he wants between him and God. This young king Josiah, he's not 8 anymore. He's older than that. But here we go. I think it says actually how old he was when he started going again to rebuild the temple. Anyway, it doesn't matter. A few years older than 8. He's still a very young man at this time. But the king stood by the pillar. He makes a covenant before Yahweh, and this was the covenant. I will walk in your ways. I will walk before you. The Hebrew word walk is halak, and it means to live or behave in a specified manner. I will live according to the words of the Mosaic law, the book of the covenant. I am committing my life to obey you. I'll keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes. Not only will I walk in the ways of the Lord, but I will keep. It's the Hebrew word shamar. It's a word that means to watch over or to guard. I'll learn these words and I'll watch over them. I'll treasure them in my heart. I'll hide them in my heart and guard them there. Wonderful man, Josiah, Yoshia. I'll keep your commandments. I'll keep your testimonies. I'll keep your statutes. All these things I've just learned about for the first time in my life in the law of the covenant, this book of the covenant. I'll do all these things. And I'll do it with all my heart and with all my soul. I'll carry out the words of this covenant that were written in this book. And look what it says right after that. Josiah makes this public statement to his fellow Jews, to the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin that he ruled over, and all the people entered into the covenant. They agreed with him. We'll do it too. In Exodus 24, going back to Moses' day, right after the 10 Commandments, Moses is still on the hill. He's getting all these instructions, all these commands from God. And in Exodus 24, Moses comes down to the people. He recounts to the people all the words that Yahweh had told him, all the ordinances, all the statutes. He gave them the Mosaic law. And what did the people do in Moses' day? They said, all the words which Yahweh has spoken, we will do. It's the same thing that they did in the days of Josiah. They promised God in the days of Moses, we will follow your commands. They didn't. In the days of Josiah, they told God, we will follow your commands. And for a little while they did. Verse 4 says, then the king commanded Hilkiah the high priest and the priests of the second order and the doorkeepers. What is he going to do now? He's made a commitment to God. He understands that that Yahweh is a jealous God. He knows the 10 commandments now. He knows the first commandment, I am the Lord God. There is no God besides me. And he knows the second commandment, which is what? No idols. No idols. You shall serve no other gods. You shall not make an idol, an image of anything. And Josiah has just committed to obey the Mosaic law. He's gotten, because of his fervor and his enthusiasm for Yahweh now, he's gotten all of Judah and Benjamin to commit to obeying the law. And so what does this young man do? What would be his charge? What does he have to do in Judah and Benjamin to live according to the Mosaic law? He has to rid that place of all their satanic idolatry. And like no one in Judah ever did, does this man Benjamin take on the job of cleaning things up for Yahweh. Look at what he does. The king commanded Hilkiah the high priest and the priests of the second order and the doorkeepers to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels that were made for Baal, the false god of the Canaanites, for Asherah, all the vessels. And now these things are inside the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. This is how far Israel had gone, Manasseh, Manasseh, and Ammon. This is how far they had fallen. They weren't the first kings of Judah to do this. They were just the latest. But he's got to get this garbage out of here that Grandpa loved. And so did Dad. This took courage. He brought the vessels that were made for Baal and Asherah, for all the host of heaven, and he burned them. He's cleansing the land. He's cleaning things up. He's making it a purified place where a Jew can worship Yahweh without all this satanic enticement to worship all this other garbage. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and he carried their ashes to Beit El. It says here that they were worshiping in the temple. They had vessels that were made for Baal, Asherah, and for all the host of heaven. You know what that means? All the host of heaven. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 19. One of my old buddy David's favorite verses. This is part of the Mosaic Law. This is part of what Josiah has just learned he cannot do, and neither can anyone in Israel. They cannot do this. Because the Mosaic Law says, and beware not to lift up your eyes to heaven and see the sun and the moon and the stars. And he names the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host of heaven, and be drawn away and worship them and serve them, those which the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. There's a reason for the sun in the sky. There's a reason for the moon in the sky. There's a reason for the stars, but it's not to worship them. And so God, knowing men that they would one day come and worship the sun and the moon, by the way, what's today called? Today. Sunday. I wonder why. What's tomorrow called? Is it Monday or is it Moon Day? Ah, it's Moon Day, isn't it? Sunday, Moon Day, Thor's Day, Frigg's Day, Saturn's Day. Do we worship the sun, the moon, and the stars? Every time we tell somebody, I'll meet you on Thursday, we're worshiping the sun, moon, and the stars. Don't take that too far. I'm just telling you the words that we use that have been adopted by humanity to talk about the days of the week are completely idolatrous. Did you know that? God said, don't worship the sun, the moon, and the stars. And that's exactly what is happening in Israel. In the temple, they have made vessels and idols to the sun, the moon, and the stars. Everybody has a sun god. Amun-Re was the great sun god in Egypt. Everybody has a sun god. Everybody has a moon god. The Romans did. The Greeks did. They're still here today. God said, don't do that. So what does the young boy do in verse 5? He did away with the idolatrous priests. If you're not a Levitical priest worshiping Yahweh, gone. He did away with the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had appointed to burn incense in the high places in the cities of Judah and in the surrounding area of Jerusalem. He is purging the land of idolatry, idolatrous leaders of worship services, these high priests. Also those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun, to the moon, to the constellations, and to all the hosts of heaven. I heard somebody to say, oh, I know who it was today, told me they were a Cancer. What is that? If I told you I'm a Scorpio, what does that mean? If I told you my mother's a Pisces, if I told you my father was also a Cancer, what am I talking about? The what? I'm talking about astrology. I'm talking about the worship of the sun, moon, and the stars. I'm talking about the fact that these astrologers think that somehow when the sun and the stars align in a certain way, it's either good luck for me or bad luck for me. What do you call that? You call that idolatry. You call that exactly what God warns against in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 19. I'll need you to leave the church. But we all use those phrases, and we think flippantly We think they're neutral phrases. They're not neutral phrases. They're straight from the pits of the devil. It's this idolatry that continues pushing into our systems and into our thoughts. Josiah did away with all that stuff. All these high priests who burned this incense to the sun and the moon and the constellations and all the hosts of heaven, he brought out the Asherah. Now these are poles, these are wooden poles. You might call them totem poles, that to put an image in your head. These are poles that were made in a female likeness for the fertility goddess Asherah. They were everywhere, carved out of trees, and he took them out of the house of the Lord. These things were standing, these abominations to this false goddess were standing in the temple. Josiah took them out. He took them outside Jerusalem to the brook Kidron, and he burned it in the brook at the brook, and he ground it to dust, and he threw its dust on the graves of the common people. He's cleansing the land like no one had in generations. He also broke down the houses of the male cult prostitutes, because worship in the pagan way was very sexualized. Male cult prostitutes, female cult prostitutes, that's how they worshiped this goddess and these gods of fertility through sex acts. So he broke down the houses of the male cult prostitutes which were in the house of the Lord. Imagine this. There was business being transacted inside the temple by pagan male cult prostitutes. His grandpa and his dad loved this stuff. Where the women were weaving hangings for the Asherah, false goddess, in the temple. You got these craftswomen weaving hangings to worship a false goddess. Then he brought out all the priests from the cities of Judah. Now, this is a reassembling of the Levitical and proper priesthood. He brings out all the proper priests from the cities of Judah, and he defiled the high places where the false priests had burned incense. He needs an army of men he can trust. Who's he going to call? The Levitical priests. He's going to call the men of God. I need you to help me purify Israel according to the book of the covenant. You know what it says. If you don't, go learn it, and let's purify this land. So he brings out the priests. They defiled the high places from Geba to Beersheba, from the north to the south. He broke down the high places of the gates which were at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city. This is Jerusalem, which are on one's left of the city gate. Verse 10 says, he also defiled Tophet. And you think, oh, what's that, Tophet? Let me tell you what Tophet was. Tophet was the place where the worshipers of the false god Molech would go and sacrifice their children to him. Human sacrifices, never called on by Yahweh. They were always animal sacrifices, but not to the pagans. And so what he did was defile Tophet. He made it impossible to sacrifice there. It says he also defiled Tophet, this place where they would worship and sacrifice their children, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or daughter pass through the fire for Molech. Can you imagine sacrificing your child to a god that doesn't exist, to try to gain favor of that God who doesn't exist instead of worshiping the one God, Yahweh? It's insanity. I mean, it is craziness what Israel had fallen to. But finally, they know the truth. They have the word that was found, that lost document, and they have it again. Verse 11, he did away with the horses. You say, horses? What are we talking about now? He did away with the horses which the kings of Judah had given to the sun. They had these holy horses set apart to the worship of the sun. Horses and chariots, they were worshiping the sun. They had given and dedicated these horses in the worship of the sun, and he did away with these horses. I'm sure he killed them. They were at the entrance of the house of the Lord, the temple, by the chamber of Nathan Melech, the official, which was in the precincts, and he burned the chariots of the sun with fire. So not only were there horses, but there were chariots that were dedicated to the worship of the sun. I don't mean God the sun, I mean the thing in the sky, the light source. Just like God says Don't look up and worship these things, because He knows the heart of man. Verse 12 says, the altars which were on the roof. I mean, look at the extent, I'm trying to show you the extent that Josiah went to purify the land of Israel. There was never another one like him. The altars which were on the roof, the upper chamber of Ahaz, another king, which the kings of Judah had made. These high places and altars where things were sacrificed, animals. The altars which Manasseh, his grandfather, had made in the two courts of the house of the Lord, the king broke down. Interesting that it mentions his own grandfather's name. Grandpa built them, grandson destroyed them because they were idolatrous. And he smashed them there, and he threw their dust into the brook Kidron. I'm just going to read it because I have it in my notes. This idea, Jeremiah 19:13 says this, the houses of Jerusalem and all the houses of the kings of Judah will be defiled like the place Tophet, because of all the houses on whose rooftops. I'm talking about the fact that they were making these altars on rooftops. It was well known and it was everywhere. And this man Josiah is going up to these rooftops and burning these altars and these false places of worship, because of all the houses on whose rooftops they burned sacrifices to all the heavenly host, the sun, the moon, the constellation, the stars, and poured out drink offerings to other gods, false gods, satanic gods. Was rampant in Israel, and Josiah is on a mission to clean it up. Verse 13, it continues, the high places. But look at how defiled Israel was. Look how deep into idolatry they were, and the lengths that he had to go to purify this land. The high places which were before Jerusalem, which were on the right of the Mount of Destruction, which Solomon the king of Israel had built. For Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians. Look at what Solomon, the wisest man on earth, did. We've talked about it. But here you go. Solomon is credited for building the abomination to Ashtoreth. And for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, the false god of Moab. And for Milcom, the false god of the sons of Ammon. The king defiled all these places. He destroyed them, made it unable to worship there again. He broke in pieces the sacred pillars. He cut down the Asherim, these Asherah poles. He cut down the Asherim and he filled their places with human bones. Furthermore, you think, oh, certainly that's it. Furthermore, the altar that was at Beth-El, Beit-El, the house of God is what Beit-El means. The house of God, there was an altar built there. Anybody remember what it was for? The altar that was at Beit-El and the high place which Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin, had made. Even the altar in the high place, he, Josiah, broke down. Then he demolished its stones. He ground them to dust, and he burned the Asherah. He has to go from village to village, place to place, rooftop to rooftop, destroying this idolatry that was all over the land of Israel. Look at these verses. The altar that was at Beit-El. Why was there an altar there, and what were the Jews worshiping? In 1 Kings chapter 12, it says Jeroboam made these things. Here it is. Jeroboam is speaking here. And this is Jeroboam, the first king of the northern tribes. If this people, the 10 tribes of the north that I've been given the rule over, if this people go to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, if they go back to the temple 3 times a year like they're supposed to, then the heart of this people will return to their God and their king Rehoboam, even to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. What Jeroboam is saying is, I can't allow the Jews to go back to Jerusalem every year. I've got to make worship centers for the northern kingdom. So the king consulted, and he made 2 golden calves. And he said to them, is it too much for you to go, or it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem? Behold, you don't have to make that trip to Jerusalem anymore. He's changing the Mosaic law. And he says, behold, Israel, your gods, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. Who does this sound like? Who else made a golden calf and told Israel, behold your gods who brought you up out of the land of Egypt? Who started that? It was Aaron, the first high priest. Exodus chapter 32. So Jeroboam says, you don't have to go back to Jerusalem, knowing that he'd lose them if they did that. So he makes 2 golden calves for them, and he set one where? At Beit El in Judah. And the other he put in Dan, which is in the farthest northern part of Israel you can get. The land of Dan today, Laish and the land of Dan, is where Hezbollah is bombing. If you want to know what Hezbollah is bombing, where that soccer field is, where they killed 12 young children and young adults the other day, it's in the land of Dan. It's in far north. We were there. Amy and I stood there. We actually stood around the altar of the golden calf in the land of Dan. We were there. You can't see that in Beit El, because in Bethel, Josiah destroyed it. But we were at the one in the north. This is when it says the altar that was at Bethel, Josiah destroyed. Look at with me in verse 21. Jump down to there. Then the king Josiah commanded all the people, and he said, celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant. Listen to that again. Celebrate the Passover. Why would he have to command Israel to celebrate the Passover? Because they hadn't been celebrating it. Why hadn't Israel been celebrating it? Because most of the Jews didn't even know it was a celebration that God expected them to celebrate. Because they didn't have the book of the law. Because Josiah's grandpa was garbage, and so was his father. Evil idolaters. And so Josiah brings about a Passover. It says in verse 22, surely such a Passover had not been celebrated. Listen to the sadness of this verse. Truly, such a Passover had not been celebrated from the days of the judges who dwelt in Israel. 500 years earlier. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, so when he's 26 years old, now we have a number on it. He began to reign at 8 years old. 18 years later, he's a 26-year-old man. In the 26th year of King Josiah, in the 18th year of his reign, the Passover was observed to the Lord in Jerusalem. Not only was he tearing things down, but he was worshiping God properly. Moreover, just a couple more. Moreover, Josiah removed the mediums, the spiritists, the teraphim, the household items. That's what teraphim are. He removed the idols, the more public idols, and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and Jerusalem, that he might, why is he doing all these things? That he might confirm the words of the Lord which were written in the book that Hilkiah the scribe, or Hilkiah the high priest, found in the house of the Lord. If this is God's book, we need to do everything it says. And all this idolatry is an abomination to the living God. And he went about like a possessed man, destroying all the evidence of idolatry in Israel. One of the greatest kings who's ever lived. Probably the greatest king who's ever lived, beside the king that will come back to reign on earth, Jesus the Christ. Look what it says about this man in verse 25. Before him, there was no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might. Of all the kings that had ruled Judah from the days of Rehoboam forward, there wasn't another king who turned like this man to the worship of Yahweh. And look what it says after that, nor did any like him arise after him. What does that make Josiah? The best of the best. There wasn't one like him before, and there wasn't one like him after. The best of the best. 8-year-old boy begins to reign. By the time he's 26 years old, he's cleaned up Israel, and he's worshiping the living God. And he's celebrating before all Israel with the high priest Hilkiah celebrating a Passover in a way that hadn't been celebrated in 500 years. The best of the best. So that should have appeased God, right? God should have been happy with Israel. Look what it says in verse 26 and 27. However, the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of His great wrath with which His anger burned against Judah because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked Him. Manasseh, grandpa, ruined things to such an extent that the holiness and righteousness of his grandson Josiah, in doing everything he could to clean up Judah, Jerusalem, it was too little and it was too late. For Josiah's life, he lived a wonderful life, but for the kingdom of Judah, God had already, because of Manasseh, what he had done, the Lord said then in verse 27, because of Manasseh, the evil king, probably the worst that the south ever had, the Lord said, I will remove Judah also from my sight, as I have removed Israel, the northern kingdom, and I will cast off Jerusalem, this city which I have chosen, and the temple of which I said, my name shall be there. It makes you wonder, even if America was to get the most godly king we've ever had, president, I should say, even if America was to get a strong biblical Christian in office, it makes you wonder whether it would already be too little, too late. Only God knows the answer to that question. He knows exactly how far we've fallen. I'm telling you that by whatever name you give it, idolatry is rampant in our country. The high places on the rooftops, most of your neighbors' houses have a high place on their rooftop. You might not be able to see it, but in their hearts and in their walk away from the living God, it's as if they have erected a high place on their rooftops. Most of our neighbors aren't wonderful, godly people. They may be nice and worship or nice and moral and ethical, but if they're not believers in the Lord Jesus Christ, studying the Word, trying to understand and live according to what the words, our words of the book of the covenant say, the New Testament, if they're not living according to this book, you can be the most moral and ethical guy ever, and you're not doing anything to help me at all. Only God knows how far America has fallen. But America is saying, okay, that's okay with me. That's all right if you do that, to things that 20 years ago were an abomination to this country. 50 years ago would never have been spoken in this country out loud. And now you see it on every sitcom. You see all the evils pervading every aspect of our lives. Our entertainment, our movies, our TV shows, our music. Satan has infiltrated all of it. And we live in a land where even if we had the greatest of leaders, it may still be, for the remnant, we may live a wonderful life in our lifetime, a life of blessing, and God offers that to each of us. We can live the life of Josiah, but it still may be too little, too late for America. We can pray for God's mercy. Only He knows what He will do. I could go on all night on this subject, but we'll stop. Heavenly Father,